She's the founding fellow of the Institute of Coaching Professional Association, affiliated with Harvard Medical School. Nancy is a pioneer in the work of practical development of leaders and specializes in managing complex situations, change management, and being a good leader over time. In her spare time, Nancy likes to travel and have visited 50 cities at least on 4 different continents, including touring as a young classical ballet soloist dancer to Cuba and China. Both were life-transforming experiences. Today, Nancy will talk to us about flexible leadership in a complex landscape. We live in a complex time where employees and managers have to meet everyday life characterized by fast-moving environment, change and competition. Which skills must leaders acquire to be able to navigate in this landscape, asks Nancy. So, welcome, Nancy.
Thank you.
The word is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Maybe just a brief introduction. I grew up in the United States, but I emigrated very, very long time ago as a young classical ballet soloist to Germany, actually to Europe. At the time, I didn't know I was emigrating, but I haven't gone back. And I acquired Irish nationality, so I'm a European and have lived in several countries in Europe, and I'm currently based in London. So I think it's helpful to have a bit of that context. And as mentioned, I actually have an unusual career path. My first career was as a classical ballet performer, soloist, dancer. And that was, of course, something I did seriously from the time I was 11 years old. So at the time of 11, I actually began working, because it's a serious profession and you have to approach it seriously. When there came a time that I had to make one of my first big transitions, the first was moving to Europe. The second was leaving dance. So of course, like all dancers, there's a moment in time when something happens and you need to move on. And I was very fortunate that time. I was living in Belgium. I actually decided to stay in Europe, and I was able to be hired as an assistant in a public relations company. And from there, I built my second career, which brought me eventually, I earned an MBA over time, and it brought me eventually to executive management. Worked for a number of different companies, and I'm based in different countries. And that was a very interesting world and an interesting life for me as well. Since then, I'm on my third career, and my third career is in developing leaders, executive leaders. And the real thing that drives me, as you'll see today, is developing them to become more human. And there's a lot of research to support the desire to do that, and I'll share with you how it can be done, based on work by many other people that I brought together. So one thing I'll mention is in leadership agility, which I'll talk about briefly today. As we know, the leader has a ripple effect, right? We all know that. We have a ripple effect. That means a drop of our water, the way we approach our day, the way we approach an interaction with someone else has a ripple effect on many other things. The leader's ripple effect is very large. I'm sure we all recognize that. And so within that, what we face today is we face a very different world. We face a world which is on the one hand dominated through analytical, AI, digital, and the fast-moving pace. And at the same time, we actually have to learn to surf that world. So what I'll share with you is moving away from, or building on rather, the ways of leading and managing in the 20th century were based on you predict, you plan, you execute, and you monitor and control. That was the way. And in today's world, as we face complexity, that is no longer adequate. We still need it, but it is not enough. And so when I share with you about the complexity very briefly, What we're going to be talking about today is leadership agility, built on a very, very robust model developed by Stephen Josephs, Bill Joyner and Stephen Josephs. And in leadership agility, it's a way that you can meet complexity. And what is complexity? Like if I were to look at an automobile, that would seem complex to me, right? Because it's the domain of experts. But it isn't actually complex, it's complicated. And it needs an expert or experts to work on it. Why is it complicated? Because if you take all of the parts of an automobile and you put them together in the proper way, you know the outcome you will have is an automobile that runs. Yeah? So the inputs, the process are known, and the output is known. If we think of complexity, which is most of our world today, it is better to think of it as the rainforest. So if you look at the rainforest, imagine it in your mind right now, it's a bit murky. It's a bit ambiguous. You can't really see everything. And there's a great deal of interdependency. If something happens underneath the water that we can't see, it's going to have an effect that we cannot predict. And so in complexity, the same starting conditions can result in very different outcomes. And I think we see that in our lives all day, every day, around us and in our own ways of living. So what I'm going to just briefly talk about today is a very brief introduction to leadership agility, because there's much more you can read out of it. There's excellent literature. But more importantly, come to something that I've developed, is the 7 senses of leadership agility. I was working in this field, working with a lot of leaders in different circumstances, and I was trying to say, what is it that I could help them develop that it would allow them to operate at these levels? I'll share those with you. Those are the 7 senses, and those are also all have a foundation of mindfulness. And then the last thing is talk to you about some practical ways forward, how you can develop this for yourself. So in the 5 levels of leadership agility, this is the work by Bill Joyner and Stephen Josephs, and it's based on a lot of research about adult development, about complexity, about the stages of development of organizations. And the idea of the agility model, which I love, is it doesn't mean you leave behind the expert and achiever. You're just going to be agilely moving between the areas depending on what's called for. So the first 2, I think we recognize them, don't we, when we think of an expert leader, an achiever leader, because that's 90% of what we have in today's world. So it's quite easy to recognize that. And I think the catalyst, co-creator, and synthesizer are less easy to recognize. If we take the first one, for example, the expert and achiever, which are called heroic types of leadership, you can of course imagine it's like the orchestra conductor, right? And that's exactly, I give direction, I bring the people together, I get the best of them, I train them, I bring them together, and we get an outcome. So that's the expert achiever. The higher levels of operating, the more developed levels of operating, are post-heroic, meaning I don't have to be the hero anymore. If I'm a leader operating as a catalyst or a co-creator or a synthesizer, I don't need to be the hero, so I'm not ego-driven. I'm actually operating from a different place, and it manifests itself in many ways. And one way to think about it as a metaphor is to consider actually you're in a chamber orchestra. And orchestras didn't even have conductors until very recently. They simply were the musicians that came together and worked together. So I'm going to skip through quickly the model so that we can move into the other areas. When you're moving into these higher levels like the catalyst, you need a systems perspective. You also have a different time perspective that was being spoken about today about some, I think you who said that we don't really connect with the far future. And we also have awareness and intent, which was also spoken about the last 2 days. There are a number of ways you operate in the agility model. I'm not going to worry about spending too much time with you, but it's basically that you're looking at how you context set, how you manage stakeholders, how you manage yourself, and how you manage innovation and creativity. What you're doing at those different levels of leadership changes, if I give you an example, if we take stakeholder agility as a perfect one, if I'm a leader operating in the more heroic levels of leadership, I'm actually working the stakeholders, right? I have a goal I want to get to, and I'm getting you involved, I'm having conversations with you, but it's for the purpose of getting you to go my way. That's typical. When you're moving into the later stages, when you're moving into the catalyst or the co-creator, you're having a different kind of stakeholder conversation. You're having a stakeholder conversation about what are our interests. how can we satisfy some of our interests? So it's not, I'm here to convince you, but rather let us really have a conversation and a dialogue and find a way forward. So those are some of the differences. And as I step into the 7 senses of leadership agility, I'll just give you a very short story. So when I was a ballet dancer, as you can imagine, that's a whole person activity. That is something that requires certainly physical. I think we all think about the physical. But it also is incredibly emotional activity. And you're probably aware of that. It's deeply emotional on all levels. It's emotional in the way that you might express, but it's also emotional in the desire and the longing you have to dance. Very, very emotional and very frustrating sometimes. It's also a very demanding cognitive activity. I think a lot of people don't realize that, but it's a demanding cognitive activity from a variety of levels. One of them is, imagine that we maybe hold 5 full-length ballets in our memory. We hold it, it's there, we pull it up a year later, we go back, it's partly muscle memory, but we hold these choreographies. And then the other thing is it's a soul-touching activity. You know, if you ever see somebody expressing dance, actually anyone dancing, you don't even have to be on a stage, isn't it just food for the soul? So here I was, this whole person activity, and I enter the world of business. And the power of the system is pretty amazing, because it didn't take me very long to have a metamorphosis into something else. So it wasn't very long before my body was simply a taxi for my head, right? It had no other function except to get me up in the morning, ideally early, and get me to where I had to go and get me on this plane and that plane into this meeting. I didn't feed it properly, I didn't take care of it, I didn't exercise it properly. So that's what happened to my body. My emotions, as we mentioned earlier, Jeremy mentioned that this morning, was something to be ignored and suppressed as much as possible. And I actually became very good at that. And then actually in terms of soul, well, the soul really wasn't very activated, because there were many times I was in situations that felt really, frankly, not very good. And I didn't feel quite good about what we might have been doing or what we were considering as leaders. So basically, all of that was left behind, and this is all that mattered. How brilliant am I? How strategic am I? You know, how can I wow them with my ideas? So what I'm going to share with you today, the 7 senses of leadership agility that I've developed, actually allow us to go back into who we are as human beings. So the good news is it's built in. We already have it. But we haven't been developing it to a large degree. Many of you have. But our society hasn't been developing it. Our society has been suppressing it. So we want to reawaken it. I think I could use this and see if that works. Oh. Okay. And in order for us to remember the 7 senses, I've given it, what is that one? It's an acronym, actually, when it forms a word. Pep Star. It formed 2 words. And I'll take you through one by one, but I'll just list them now for you. So the first one is positive regard for self and others. We talked a lot about that today and yesterday in different ways. The second one is engagement and inquiry, or inquiry, depending on which part of the Atlantic you live in, right? So am I engaging, am I inquiring? The third one is perspective taking, which we also talked about some today, and I'll go into that in more detail, taking different perspectives. So again, I'm not learning about your perspective so I convince you that mine's better. I'm actually really curious to know what your perspective is and to integrate it. The fourth one, which is sometimes a difficult one to get our minds around, but in fact is the most important, I think, is sense-making for 21st century complexity. And to give you an example, I worked in a program for about 4 years with a large multinational high-tech manufacturer. And we did a program of 3 days around agility and complexity, building agility for the leaders who were dealing in very complicated matters, but had complexity all around them. And they found at the end of the 3 days that the sense-making, which I'll share with you later, was the most difficult and the most important to develop. The next one is tension used productively. So we have tension, how do we use it? The next one is attention management, which we've spoken about today and yesterday. And the last is reflective practices, something that our world has lost sight of. And we can bring it back, and it doesn't need an hour a day, it can be 5 minutes. So I'm going to just take us through each one of those, just checking in with everyone if that's good. How's the pace, the speaking? I know I'm between you and lunch, so we'll try to keep it lively. Okay. So I think it's important to think of these not as a list or a hierarchy, but as doors. Each one of these 7 senses is a doorway. And when I'm working with leaders also, we don't worry about ticking off all the 7. It's just what's called for here. Which of these senses would, by developing, encourage them to grow into agility? And also it's important for people to walk in the door they want to walk into. And when they do open that door, they then open it into beauty, into complexity, into dynamics. So whatever door you take, it's fine. You don't need to worry about all 7. And as I mentioned, this one's tired. Mindfulness is the enabler, as you'll see, of all of these 7. So it is an enabler. It actually allows you to be able to develop these 7. You probably could do it without mindfulness, maybe, I'm not sure. But it certainly would take more effort and would take more time. So positive regard, let's do it quickly ourselves. For one thing, which is excellent, we did self-compassion earlier, which is critical, but it's also positive regard for others. And there's also something we need to build in ourselves. It's like a reservoir that we want to build of positivity. You may be familiar with the ratio of 3-to-1, positive to negative, by Barbara Fredrickson, where the studies, it varies a bit, but roughly we need 3 positive experiences to 1 negative experience to leave with a feeling of positivity or neutral. And that makes sense because we're wired to remember the negative. We all know that the negative sticks, and we experience it every day. So just take a moment. I'll invite you to just do a very, very short exercise for yourselves. Just reflect, each person, over the last 24 hours for yourself. While you're reflecting, anything that didn't go the way you would like it to, you just allow that to slip away for now. Anything that was good, that brought you joy or a smile to your face, it could be something very small, it could be something very big. Just savor that and keep going. It'll only take a minute until you find 3 good things, and I'll do it at the same time. Last 24 hours, and keep reflecting until you find 3 good things. Anyone need more time? Just raise your hand. Okay. So, and this will be the hard part, but just take one minute to turn to the next person next to you and tell them what that experience was like. You can share them, or you can just say how it felt. So I'm going to time 1 minute to have a quick sharing of how that felt. Just a couple of comments, what you noticed. Anything that you noticed about it. How was that experience? Good, okay. What else?
It was interesting, it was relationships that came up.
Yeah. Which gives you actually a double boost. You get the oxytocin too. Others, how was the experience?
Very quickly noticed my self-critic.
Yes.
I said, oh, you will remember that.
Yes.
You won't
You won't be able to do it, it's only a minute.
too quick.
Yeah, so the self-critic comes up, yeah. And then you invited them to walk for a bit away. Okay. And did she? Oh, sorry, yes. He noticed his self-critic coming up quite quickly. I won't remember, or I don't know if I have 3 things. So just, anyone notice the energy in the room? Change in the energy? Yeah, it's uplifted, right. That took 1 minute, maybe 1 minute, 20 seconds at the most. So imagine, and this is very well researched by Martin Seligman and a number of people. So there's a lot of research that shows if you do this every night before going to sleep, write them down if you like to write things. I like to write, so I write them down. And you just savor those before you fall asleep. There's research that shows a variety of outcomes. For one, people who might be down or feeling a bit depressed, that improves in a couple of weeks. And the other thing is that you can do it all the time, but you can do it for periods, and it can last as much as 6 weeks, the effects of the positivity. Imagine if we opened meetings that way. Imagine if we opened meetings that way. It also primes us neurologically. It primes us to be more open-minded. Our critic, as you said, is for the moment resting, and we're able to open neurologically to possibilities. One last thing I'll share with you on that, which you may be aware of, is the 10 positive emotions, also worked by Barbara Fredrickson. There are, of course, all emotions are very useful, positive emotions are useful, but she found 10 that are particularly impactful. And to give you an example, I've got all 10, I'll show you the other 5 in a moment. The people who've written up a great deal, who've done a lot of work, Prochaskas, James and Janet Prochaska, are leaders in self-change. How do we change ourselves? How do we change our habits? And they recommend using these 10 positive emotions to build a reservoir, so that you're also, when you're facing the moment when you have to, it's a bit of an effort to change that habit, you have this reservoir to draw upon. And so these emotions, a client of mine has this on his screensaver. He has these on his screensaver because he works in a very, very, very tough field. So every time he picks up his phone, he's triggered a positive way to saying, oh, but I've just had joy. I just had a wonderful experience with a client, right? Or he immediately thinks of his children and feels great love. So it's seconds and very, very powerful. So moving on to the next one, engage and inquire. So of course we know we want to engage people. Inquire is a very interesting one, and one I work a lot with clients on. Because generally speaking in the business world, what we're trying to do is we're trying to advocate, right? We're actually there, I'm having a discussion with you, but I'm advocating my point of view. I'm defending my point of view. So we actually have a mindset of advocate, and therefore we need to develop as well, to be able to balance them, a mindset of inquiry. And then the levels of catalyst, co-creator, and synthesizer, this is one of the hallmarks, is that at these levels they balance. When is it time to advocate? When is it time to inquire? So inquiry is an interesting one. So having a more open view, investigating like a curious reporter. Inquiry, there's a marvelous work by Edgar Schein of Harvard called Humble Inquiry, with an I. It's published in America. Humble Inquiry, very small book. I can't recommend it enough. And he says it's very simple. Humble inquiry is asking a question you don't know the answer to. Asking a question you don't know the answer to. If we think about leaders, how often do they ask those questions? Or are they asking questions that they actually know the answer to and they're testing whether you do, right? Or they're asking because they want to do a quick fire. Okay, well, what do you think about this? What about that budget? What were the numbers here? So a different way is somebody comes to you with a problem and he says, look, I'm really struggling right now with the building project. And then the humble inquiry says, well, that's interesting. Come on and have a seat. What would you like from me? Well, what a way to start a conversation. What would you like from me? How can I help? Well, first of all, the leader doesn't know the answer to that question, right? Only the person there can, but it also sets a whole different tone. And then when they share what they'd like and say, so how's it going? So what are you concerned about? I don't know the answer to that question. What have you thought of? What have you tried? What's been working? What hasn't? All of those are, okay, I don't know the answer to those questions. And that's a different kind of mindset. We're okay to move on? Checking in? Okay. So the next one is perspective-taking, which we've spoken about a great deal over the last couple of days, and it's critical. And of course, mindfulness for this is absolutely critical. I will not be able to open up my perspectives if I don't have a practice that is allowing me to be with what is, and to notice what is. And also to notice when I'm clinging to something that I rather like, which might be my point of view. So this is a very interesting one because perspectives actually change the truth. So which one's right? They both are. And as I mentioned earlier, in the higher levels of leadership agility, when you're operating as the catalyst, you might need to be the achiever when you're in front of the investors. You, as a leader, you have to be the achiever. That's who they want to see there. But when you're working with your teams and you're the catalyst or the co-creator, you're actually interested in their perspectives because your world view is completely inadequate. Completely inadequate. You talked about that as well. We construct our own worlds. When I did my qualification training with John Kabat-Zinn, I'll never forget this. It was incredibly impactful when he said, actually, you know those stories we have going on in our heads? Does anyone else have stories going on? Just checking. I haven't yet met the person who doesn't, so I'm feeling better now. So these stories that are going on in our heads, right? Well, they're quite vivid, aren't they? Yeah. So as John says, the interesting thing about that is that you're the writer, you're the producer, you're the director, and you're the actor in those stories. And they're based on either inadequate, incomplete, or sometimes false information. But we hang on to them and believe them. And that's what perspective taking is about. Recognizing your own stories and your own perspectives and gaining the value of others. So that you might realize it's both a 6 and a 9. Moving on to sense making, as I mentioned. So sense-making was one that I had difficulty getting my head around as well. And then I heard of this wonderful expression that at the time that China opened up, I think it was 1978 to the early 80s, Deng Xiaoping was the leader. And he said, people said, but how are you going to do this? You've been closed for decades. How will you do it? And he said, I don't know. We'll do it by feeling the stones to cross the river. So you have to imagine a river where you can actually walk, right? So it's not too big, but you can't see everything in that river, and you don't know how to get to the other side. So you have to put your foot on the first stone, and you have to feel it, and you have to test it. Can I step on it? And then I step to the next one. I thought that was a wonderful metaphor for navigating complexity, which is exactly what they had to do. So sense making is about that. It's trying out, it's testing, it's imagining what it could be and then trying it out to see if it is. And it requires mindfulness because somebody mentioned it today, you need this sensory clarity. I think it was you, Sama. You need the sensory clarity to be able to really feel those stones. And if you don't feel the stone, by the way, imagine what can happen, right? If you step here and you haven't felt the stone, well, you might be learning to swim very quickly, or you may fall on a rock. So sense-making is a critical one. The other thing is there's work by, I don't know if you're familiar with him, David Snowden, who was the head of research at IBM, S-N-O-W-D-E-N, he's Welsh. And there's an article, it's an article from many years ago, but it's excellent, called Decision-Making and Complexity, I think, that he wrote for the Harvard Business Review. But he did very, very robust work on a model of decision-making. And he was explaining that in complexity, you approach complexity differently than you approach complicated, differently than simple or straightforward. And he said you have to first probe, you have to try something out, just as you do in agile methods. Try it out, sense make, and then respond. And that is, I think, absolute key in today's world in leadership. Also when you're having a conversation, you don't know stepping into that conversation how it's going to be. You can't know. The same starting conditions may result in very different outcomes. So it's probing, testing, sense-making. So tension is an interesting one, and it's actually one that I struggled with a great deal, and it's still present for me. It's something I don't like tension necessarily. There are also certain emotions I don't like, but I have them. And the same thing with tension, and the idea of productive use of tension. This comes also from work from Michael Kavanagh and Gordon Spence at the University of Sydney, who've done a lot of work on this growth growth in adult development levels, when you grow into the higher levels of adult development. And they talk about the leader, we often look at skills development, sort of horizontal development, and we forget to develop ourselves as persons, as people, that that's actually what we need. And in the case of tension, as they described, and I found this very compelling, they said a bridge cannot stand without tension. Cannot stand without tension. And one of the first things that engineers and architects do when they're considering to build a bridge is they study the geography or the topography. And generally speaking, they can't change it. And I think that's a marvelous metaphor for stepping into a situation where you need to have a productive conversation. Study the geography, your own and theirs. Recognize that you actually can't change, but you can approach the tension productively. Imagine if you were watching a film or a play or viewing a piece of art that had no dramatic tension in it. It would be very boring. You would turn off within 3 minutes. So tension can actually be a very, very positive thing, and it can be used, as any of us have had. I'm sure we've all had experiences where we actually have succeeded in having a tense conversation, and the outcome and the relationship was far better afterwards. Again, tension, the one thing that enables me to use it more productively is my mindfulness practice. Because I'm able also in the moment to just basically recognize the physical signs of my anxiousness or my fear, and able to take a breath and take a pause, and then act hopefully from choice and not from the typical habit. Can't say as I always manage, but it's definitely a work in progress. The next one is attention management, which we've talked about a great deal today in the last 2 days. Attention management, there have been tremendous explanations today, but the one thing that I would add is it is a muscle, and it's a muscle that needs constant training, because the amount of distractions is frankly overwhelming, right? It was mentioned yesterday, I think it was Stefan, you who mentioned it, that if we get distracted, we lose 30 minutes. That's very well studied. If we get distracted, if we get that little ping and we look at the email, and we were doing something cognitively demanding, it will take our brains 30 minutes to get back to the same level of performance. Imagine how much time we would save. So it's simple things. I don't know if you've done it. I've taken off all notifications on my phones, except text messages, SMS. Very old-fashioned. It's the only way people know if they absolutely have to reach me. They phone me or they send me a text. So removing as many distractions as we can, getting the telephone out of the bedroom. That's something I work with a lot of my clients. I work also one-to-one. One of the key things we work with is getting it out of the bedroom. In little steps, I say, okay, right now it's next to the bed. Do you think you could move it over to the desk? And it's a habit. It's an addiction to a certain degree. And it has an incredible impact on their sleep. Incredible impact. Also, as you know, stopping distractions and interaction with media an hour before you go to sleep. Lowering the lights, treating ourselves as human beings and giving us the things that we need to live and work well. The other thing I would mention to you about attention management was something that I learned, which I found fascinating. Practice spelling words backwards. Okay, so right now if I throw out the word chair, spell it backwards. Go ahead, it's okay, it takes time. Chair. Okay, desk, that's an easy one. Desk, anyone? K-S-E-D, right? Okay, pillow. That gets more difficult. When they're 2 syllables, it's more difficult. But literally do this. I mean, sometimes getting ready in the morning, I just start spelling words backwards in my head. So I usually start with dog and cat, because those are easier. But it's no kidding, and you find it. It's actually it's a cognitive exercise for exercising. It's how I sometimes imagine little weightlifters in my brain, lifting the weights of attention, lifting the weights of cognitive ability. I picked this up actually preparing for this today, and I thought it was appropriate. It was a Nobel-winning economist. In 1977, he warned that information consumes the attention of its recipients, hence a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, and we see this. I don't know if you've heard this before, but are you aware that multitasking lowers your IQ? Okay, so you're aware of that. I mean, that usually gets the attention of executives. But then they go on to say their IQ is high enough that they can afford the loss of 8 to 10 points. So finally, on the senses, is the reflective practices. And this is one, actually, that I've come to more recently in my work and my studies, the power of reflection. Of course, in mindfulness practice, there is a deal of some reflection, there's contemplation, right? But really formally reflecting. So my work is primarily, it's in executive development. It might be one-to-one, it might be with teams, It might be as part of a leadership program, but if I'm working with one-to-one, the difference it makes for me to take some intentional reflection just before I go into that conversation with my client is it's an incredible pivot. The leverage is amazing. So what I recommend to do is always before an important conversation or something that you value, really a few minutes, we're talking 3 to 5 minutes of pre-reflection. I then recommend post-reflection. Immediately afterwards, as soon as you can afterwards, when I do it, I notice the difference. When I don't, I also notice the difference. So again, writing, reflecting, ideally writing, handwriting, as you know, is also very good for us, but really capturing. And by doing this, the agile leader, the one who's working at the levels of catalyst, co-creator, and synthesizer, their ability to reflect in the moment grows. And that's the next stage. So if you do enough pre- and post-reflection, and you're doing a mindful practice, you are able to be in the moment and reflect. And to act and choose. A very, very short time, a very short anecdote is I was with a client, working with her already, and sometimes you have like a 3-way conversation with their boss. And so I went to meet her in the country where she's working. We were already enjoyed working together, and she wanted me to meet him. And for us to have a 3-way conversation was always very good. You know, we get not just alignment, but we also really get an understanding of what this approach wants to achieve. And I'm sitting there at a round table. So first I met him, and he was head of procurement of everything to do with pharma for a huge pharmaceutical company. So I mean, a very powerful position. And I walk in, and he was immense. I mean, he was gigantic, you know, a very tall man, you know, very broad-shouldered, and I'm not so gigantic, you know, at least not physically. So I walked in, and I was with her, and I walked in, and I said hello, and he had a wonderful warm handshake, and our eyes met in a very warm way, and I thought, this is really going to be great, you know. I came in with unconditional positive regard. I noticed in the moment, this is a very big man. I'm a small woman, and I'm aware that could have an effect on me, that I could feel a sense of fear or being little. So I was aware of that. I reflected in the moment, had this wonderful handshake with him. We started the conversation. I was enjoying the conversation. My early warning sign physically is here, visceral. I started to feel something here. And I said to myself, it's interesting. Reflection in the moment, while I'm having the conversation, I'm saying, quick scan. I said to myself, I'm not nervous. I'm fine. I love this conversation. So then I said to myself, somebody here is nervous because we have mirror neurons, and I'm aware of that. So in the moment, I'm reflecting, realizing somebody at the table is nervous. I don't know whether it's her or him. So what did I do? I did, a mindful breath, put my 2 feet on the floor underneath the table, took a good mindful breath, opened my heart, and continued the conversation. We had a great talk. We go back to the office. We're on the way back to the office. She goes, oh my God. Oh, thank goodness. She said, I was so nervous. It was so important for me that he likes you and that he wants you to work with me. In the moment, I picked it up. It wasn't my nerves, it was her. And I could only do that if I was having a mindful practice and reflective practices. That's how you grow it in the moment. So that gives us Pep Star. And I'm just looking at the time. So we've got a few minutes just to talk about how can you build some of these. So something quite interesting is happening here. Oh, there we go. So mindfulness is the enabler, as I've mentioned to you before, and I think the talks the last couple of days have probably hopefully shown a lot of those links, otherwise I'm happy to speak with you. The other thing I would share, okay, so how can you develop these senses? I've given some examples. If there were a few things you would want to do, is you want to build your positivity and your self-compassion, and that's an active practice. So it's the 3 good things, it's the 10 positive emotions, do it actively. The other thing is investigate humble inquiry and practice it. It is, again, everyone who tries it and has those kinds of conversations, first of all, for a leader, it is much less work because they're encouraging the other person to find their own internal resources. Practice in mindfulness, there are two different kinds of practices. One is a focused attention practice. You may be aware of that. Might be one, for example, if we're noticing the breath, or if we're doing a body scan. And there are also open awareness practices, sounds and thoughts, there are a variety. I'm sure there are resources for you that we'll share. Sincerely seek others' views. Practice that. And frankly, you can practice this. You don't even have to practice it at work first. You can try it at home. Really have conversations with people, friends and family, where you're really interested in their views, not to convince them, but to understand where they're coming from. Exercise perspective. Take the time to spend in nature. If you like art, things that change you, do volunteering in sectors that are completely different from what you do. Meet young people. Spend time with young people, but not as the wise person, but more as the curious learner. And then, as I mentioned, the reflecting pre and post interactions, and you can as much as get away with minutes on a daily and weekly basis. You literally can just put in the 5 minutes or the 2 minutes a day, and you will find it will start to make a difference. You'll enjoy it so much you want to do more. So when I started my talk, when you read and you thought, okay, leadership, agility, this all sounds very complicated, very difficult, I hope I've shared with you that it's actually wonderful because it's something we can all build by building on our innate things. So if you might have imagined that it was something like this, very difficult, that's how agile you had to be, or even like this, which is quite worrying. That's what we build up in our minds. What I'd like to share with you is it's actually this. So it's just co-creating at work, and it's something every one of us can do. So thank you. Thanks very much.